Hi, welcome to Qigong Project. I'm Robert Kuhns. Today we're going to be talking about the Xiaozhoutian, the small heavenly orbit, in internal alchemy, Qigong, and Daoyin practice. Before we can start talking about the small heavenly orbit, we need to understand what a heavenly orbit is. In ancient Chinese astronomy, heavenly orbit refers to the track along which the sun, moon, and stars seem to move. Of course, today we know that it's the Earth that orbits around the sun, but never mind. In ancient times, the heavenly orbit refers to where the positions of the sun, moon, and stars are in the sky. And this is a non-trivial task to measure because relative to time of year, those positions change. That is to say that if you look at the trajectory of the sun at the summer solstice and the trajectory of the sun at the winter solstice, they are necessarily somewhat different. And so the idea of the Zhoutian is this circulation which can then be measured. Now, in humans, the Xiaozhoutian, the small heavenly orbit, refers to something sort of similar to the idea in Hermetic thought of as above, so below. Now, don't get me wrong, Hermetic thought is not Chinese, but I think you'll find that much of the ancient and medieval world thought according to approximately the same worldview. What happens outside the body in nature also happens within the body. Ergo, the body is a small version of heaven and earth, or as the Hermetic philosophers would have said it, as above, so below. So this idea of small heavenly orbit is meant to describe something about the movement of sun and moon in the body? Well, kind of. So I'm not exactly clear about exactly when this idea started to be used. The earliest reference that I've seen to the term Zhoutian used in the context of Taoist meditation practice was probably from about 1000 AD in a text called Daan by Xiao Tingzhi. So the question and answer of the golden elixir by Xiao Tingzhi. But I'm sure the idea was probably used earlier than that. However, what the Xiaozhoutian, what the small heavenly orbit basically represents universally in Qigong, Neigong, Daoyin, and even the internal martial arts is the movement of qi up the spine to the brain and then back down the front of the body, back to the umbilical area. So with that in mind, actually the ancestors of internal alchemy called the Xiaozhoutian by a different name. They referred to something called He-che. He-che means the river wheel. And in the oldest iteration of internal alchemy, the school is called Jindan Pai, the golden elixir school, rather than Neigong, rather than internal alchemy. In the oldest version of internal alchemy, Jindan Pai, there were many different individual body parts used to describe the circulation of this energy. So as an example, the river wheel is commonly thought to be in the kidneys. The kidneys, in Taoist thought, doesn't only refer to the kidney organ in the back, it refers to the complex of the kidneys, the bladder, and also the external genitals, which are called the Waishan, the external kidneys. And so another name for it in Taoism is the water palace. So there's a very, very famous line in Taoist practice which says, 北方黑水为和车. The black water in the north is referred to as the river wheel. What that means is this area of the body which is responsible for water physiology, like the kidneys and the bladder and the genitals, then they have this water wheel. They have the ability to move water from up to down. A water wheel in ancient China is a kind of mechanical device which has a series of buckets and it's set around a spoke. And so basically it picks water up from a lower place and delivers it to a higher place. So this idea of 北方黑水为和车, right? The black water in the north is the river wheel, refers to the idea that these very yin organs of the body, which are usually used for approximately for filtering blood and getting rid of the toxins in blood as urine, or getting rid of the waste material in blood as urine, right? So the kidneys and the bladder and the external genitals, they also have potential to generate rising energy in the body. So that rising energy, anyway, we can talk about that in another video, but that rising energy comes from the original essence, the yuan jing of the body. And then it's transformed, and it causes the true qi, what's called the zhen qi of the body, to be able to move up the back. So that was traditionally what the river wheel was called. But then at other stops along the way, there were other sections, right? So for instance, in the spine, there's supposedly 3 gates, right? The tailbone area has something called the Weilu gate, which is the first place the qi passes. The thoracic spine has something called the Jiaji gate, which is the second place the qi passes. The occiput on the back of the head has a gate called the Yuzhen, or the jade pillow gate, where the qi passes, and it moves into the brain, which is called the Niwan, or the mud ball. Then after it moves to the brain, the qi rests in the brain for a while, and then according to some internal alchemy practice, some internal alchemy classics, it moves to something called the Jade Lake. Sometimes it's called the Jade Lake. And so that Jade Lake can refer to the qi infusing into the saliva, and then the saliva then is a fluid that has qi in it. It's called yuye, jade fluid. And then after that fluid is swallowed, then it moves down the throat, which is called the Shi'er Zhonglo, the 12-story mansion. And then it essentially goes back to the abdomen, to the stomach. And then from there, when it arrives in the stomach, then people meditate and focus behind their umbilicus to try to attract the qi back to the lower dantian area, or the middle and lower dantian area. So that's approximately the circuit of what came to be known as the small heavenly orbit. However, by the 15th century, people began referring to this orbit as the Xiaozhoutian, the small heavenly orbit, or by another name, which is the Ziwuzhoutian. That's the really important word that we should focus on for our discussion of internal alchemy. So by the 15th century, people such as Wu Chongshu, one of the founders of the Wuliu school of internal alchemy, referred to this as the Ziwuzhoutian. Zi is a character which means the time between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m., or the winter solstice, and Wu is 11 a.m. to 1 p.m., or the summer solstice. And so these two things are at opposite ends. So the Ziwuzhoutian has 2 major meanings. One meaning is that in the body, there's a point where the energy goes from being very, very yin in nature to becoming yang. So that's representative of the winter solstice, or around the time of midnight, because the winter solstice is the darkest time of the year, but after that, the energy begins to come back and the sun begins to return, right? And then on the other hand, the time of midnight is the deepest point of night, but then after that, morning starts to come, right? 12 a.m. is called the morning rather than 12 at night, right? We colloquially call it 12 at night, but it's actually 12 in the morning. And so this idea of zi refers to going from the deepest yin state and generating yang. On the other hand, wu refers to the summer solstice, so when the yang has reached its highest, when the sun and the brightness has reached its highest, and then when it starts to go down, right? So we, after the summer solstice, have incrementally less sunlight in the environment until the winter solstice. Or it could refer to midday, which is also the time when the sun begins to go toward evening, even though it's still the afternoon, right? And so this points out when the change from yang to yin happens. So that's the broad meaning of Ziwuzhoutian, right? The circulation of, let's say, midnight and midday. Can we say that? Maybe. But then a deeper idea is that this is facilitated actually from heaven and earth. So the saying in internal alchemy is that heaven refers to earth refers to the lower abdomen, right? So the area under the umbilicus is called the kunlu. It's called the earth burner. And then heaven is referred to as the head, actually the baihui point on top of the head, or we can say generally in the brain. And so that's called the tianding, the heavenly cauldron. By the way, be careful. My pronunciation of tones is not very good. And if you say tianding wrong, it means to kiss somebody's ass. So if you're going to learn tones, don't learn them from me. Anyway, so then the idea is that zi represents if you think about the Earth is represented in the hexagrams of the Book of Changes as 6 broken lines. And after that, there's nowhere to go except for it to return back to developing yang energy. So the yang energy is represented by the 24th hexagram, which is called fu. Fu means to return. And so when the yang energy returns, it goes to fu. That has 2 major meanings. One meaning is that when you're meditating, you go from the most profound state of tranquility and quietude and self-forgetting, and then your body starts to spontaneously generate energy. Actually, it's exactly the same. It's not exactly the same, but it's based on the idea of when you're asleep, right? When you're sleeping, sometime in the night, your body starts to repair itself and it starts to re-energize so that it can get you ready to wake up and have energy in the morning. Or you can imagine like an animal hibernating in the winter, right? It rests for a certain period of time so that in the spring it can become active again. So this is the basic idea of zi, or the 24th hexagram of the I Ching, fu, which means to return. The yang energy starts to return. Fu, right? Zi is a way that we call the winter solstice, but the winter solstice is represented by the fu hexagram, the return hexagram, because it's one yang line under 5 yin lines. So then when the energy rises up the back, then gradually it's going toward wu, which is midday or the summer solstice. When it reaches the peak, which is baihui, so the 100 meetings point on top of the head, then at that point it's considered to have reached its yang peak, and now it's going to go toward yin. So that's represented by wu, or it's represented by the hexagram go, which is when yang, pure yang, begins to change and transform into yin and then descend in the body. So that's the other meaning of ziwu, is that the energy travels between the most yin point of the body and the most yang point of the body. When it's in the most yin point of the body, it's nested in the lower abdomen and it approximately reaches down to the perineum, right? So very, very yin place. There's not much, upward energetic activity going on there. But when it reaches its maximum point, then it has to move up. And so when it moves up, it does so spontaneously. And when you're well acquainted with Neigong practice, when it moves to the head, it starts to produce spiritual illumination, right? And so that sign plus the rising energy is how we know that it's yang in nature rather than yin. So it reaches the maximum point of yang, and then from there it gradually starts to descend again. That's the main idea of the Ziwu Zhou. So it can either be represented as like, Zi being in the very, very lower base of the spine and Wu being approximately just in front of the baihui, or it can be represented as the energetic transformation from yin to yang. And that makes up really the epistemic background of the most sort of like beginner level of internal alchemy, right? So what we're trying to get at in the beginner level of internal alchemy, when we connect the so-called small heavenly orbit, is the Ziwu Zhou. Now later on in practice, there's also other heavenly orbits like the Maoyo Zhou, which moves diagonally around the body. That's a different story for a different episode. But after all those things are done, then people move on to the Da Zhou, the large heavenly orbit, which is basically the vertical movement of the energy, plus how the energy relates to the space and the time around the body. Again, another topic for another video. So that's the internal alchemy understanding of it in a nutshell. Now, there's so much more to it. I mean, God, you could go on about this stuff for ages, because internal alchemy is a simple practice, but it's a complex phenomenon. And so you can practice with only knowing a little bit, but then to be able to understand what's really happening, you really need to be a little bit scholarly in your approach. But that, broadly speaking, at least it's a basic enough understanding of the small heavenly orbit to move on to the next thing, which is Daoyin practice. So Daoyin has been around in China for a long time. Probably, let's put it this way. The first mention of Daoyin in literature is in the Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi is a text which is maybe 2,400 years old. It is an old text. But doubtless it existed before Zhuangzi. Otherwise, why would he mention it, right? If it was brand new when he mentioned it. By the way, Zhuangzi didn't like Daoyin very much. He thought that people who practiced Daoyin, which is basically, stretching, basically, in its earliest form, he didn't like those people very much. He thought they were wasting their time. But it must have existed before him, right? And so in Daoyin practice, the original old Daoyin practice doesn't have the concept of the small heavenly orbit. The small heavenly orbit probably originated in internal alchemy. It's hard to say. There are some outstanding books from around the time that internal alchemy was created, such as Lingjianzi, which teach visualization, Daoyin, and breathing practices that open the same energetic circuit as the small heavenly orbit. They don't use the term small heavenly orbit, they use different terms. So it's possible that people outside of the internal alchemy world were practicing these things. But the way that I like to think about it is the practice at that time, such as in the text Lingjianzi, which is a very famous one, or Lingbao Bifa, they were early attempts at creating an internal alchemy school of practice, which were predicated on practices that would ultimately be discarded by internal alchemy practitioners. That's why we differentiate the terms Neidong and Daan. So Neidong means internal alchemy. It begins with the master Zhang Daan, who wrote the book Understanding Reality, Wu Zhen Pian. And before that, the original school was called Jindan Pai, and they say it was passed down via Hanzhong Li to Lu Dongbin, but we should take Lu Dongbin basically as the founder of the Jindan school of thought. After Lu Dongbin wrote various poems about the golden elixir, which incidentally, right, the idea here is that the golden elixir is abstracted from external alchemy practice, which is much, much older. But as a meditative practice that doesn't involve external alchemy, we can say it approximately started with Lu Dongbin. The problem was he left behind some very terse poems on the subject. And so many people after him had to guess what he was trying to say. So, as an example, the most famous thinker after Lu Dongbin, his name is Shi Jianwu, and he wrote two books. One is called Zhonglu Chuandaoji. So Lu Dongbin and Hanzhong Li, they pass down the Tao, the anthology of Lu Dongbin and Hanzhong Li passing down the Tao. The other is called Lingbao Bifa, like the secret method of the numinous treasure. And so the first book, Chuandaoji, is a theoretical discussion of internal alchemy, and then Lingbao Bifa is the proposed method of practice. But if you compare the practice in in Lingbao Bifa to later internal alchemy documents after the creation of Neidong, you'll find that it's very different, right? It's all kinds of like breath holding and Daoyin and visualization and stuff like that. It's not the same as what would ultimately come out after Zhang Boduan passed down his version of internal alchemy, which became the most famous. So even though we can say that those sort of very old Taoist practices from the Tang and Song dynasty practiced visualization, Daoyin, and specialized breath work to open up the orbit, we have to think of this maybe as a preamble to internal alchemy, which borrowed from older methods, which was ultimately replaced, rather than thinking about it as a completely separate school of Daoyin practice. However, by the 19th century, well, by about the 1700s actually, the Daoyin school began to develop its own version of the small heavenly orbit. So we know this because of certain period texts, among which there are two very popular ones. One which you will probably recognize and one which you will probably not recognize. So the one which you would probably recognize is called Ba Duan Jin, or Shi Er Duan Jin, or Shi Liu Duan Jin. So the 8 silk brocades, the 12 silk brocades, or the 16 silk brocades. That text, that practice was mentioned as early as the Song dynasty, so as early as the 900s or 1000s approximately, in the text Ling Shu, the pivot of the Tao. But the first known document we have of that method, teaching it as a physical cultivation method, is actually from the Chinese medicine tradition. And so people practiced the 12 silk brocades. However, if you've ever done 8 silk brocades, holding up the heavens, pulling the bow, right, these kind of things, that totally was not what this original version of the silk brocades was. Originally, the silk brocades were a seated Daoyin practice with only some stretching postures. The majority of it was done using the internal body and the intention. Things like clicking the teeth, circling the tongue around, swallowing saliva, carrying it to the dantian, right? So we're already thinking about opening the front part of the small orbit. But then at the end of the text, it teaches how to place a little ball of fire in the umbilical area, move it to the huiyin, to the perineum, and then move it up the back to the head, and then back down the body. And that's called the small heavenly orbit as well. So that approach to practice is a Daoyin-centric version, which became popular during the late during the late Ming Dynasty or early Qing Dynasty. It may be older, but I place it there because that's where it's first mentioned, as far as I know. And if you know better, then tell me in the comments. But then this developed over time. And so another text that I like that has a similar practice is called Xiaoyaozi Daoyin Chui. So the let's say the Daoyin formula of the master of carefree wandering. And this one teaches the small orbit from the perspective of, again, imagining a fireball, but this time you imagine it in the left foot first. Then it goes up the back of the body to the top of the head. Then it comes down, and then you swallow your saliva and collect it back. Bring the energy down the Ren meridian, down the throat, right? And then to the inner abdomen, and then bring the energy back down the leg, and do it again a total of 3 times. Then switch to the right side, do it 3 times. And then starting from the tailbone, imagining the fire going up over the head and coming back down, repeating the process 3 times using the so-called Ren and Du meridians, right? So the Ren meridian being the meridian that, well, it runs up. In Chinese medicine, it runs up the front of the body. But in internal practice, it runs down the front of the body via the throat. And then the Du meridian, which runs the length of the spine, right? So Xiaoyaozi Daoyin Chui has that kind of practice as well, right? And so we can see that the idea of small heavenly orbit, it leaves the internal alchemy imperative, which is related to transforming tranquility into activity, or non-being into being, or yin into yang, right? You have to get into a very deep meditation, become very peaceful, become very still, and then the orbit activates itself. The Daoyin approach is what we call post-heaven, right? It's more emphasizing using a mental activity to develop this. Now, from the Neidan perspective, this is wrong. In Neidan, they call this Kongzhuan Heche, right? So the empty circulation of the river wheel. And they consider that to be bad practice. It's detrimental to Neidan practice because it doesn't teach you how to convert the essence into qi through the process of generating pure yin and then having yang be born within it, which is the core principle of internal alchemy. So from the internal alchemy perspective, it's a wrong practice. But from the perspective of Daoyin, it's not a wrong practice. Why should you practice that way if you just want to be more healthy, right? We're not trying to generate the spirit and transform the spirit to Dao and this kind of stuff in Daoyin practice. We're just trying to make the body healthier. So then this leads into the next topic, which is modern Qigong. So, if you've ever practiced Qigong, you've for sure heard of the small heavenly orbit. It's one of the first things people talk about, even though often they don't really know how to practice it. So the small heavenly orbit in Qigong practice, there's various variations of it, but the most famous one was created by somebody named Li Shaobo. Li Shaobo was a Qigong thinker during the 20th century, and he developed a method called what's it called? Yunqi, Zhenqi Yunxing Fa. There we go. So the true qi circulation method, right? Zhenqi Yunxing Fa by Li Shaobo. So this method is the same in terms of the structure of the Neidan method, right? The qi goes up the spine to the brain and then back down to the umbilicus. But the difference is that Li Shaobo, he wanted to get people to be able to generate the energy faster. In Neidan, it takes at least 3 months of really serious practice to be able to even start to think about opening the small orbit. And it can take like a year or 2 to connect it. And for me, it took about 5 years to complete it, right? Neidan is serious stuff. You have to really be dedicated to be able to do it. But Li Shaobo, he created a method which is faster to achieve. Now, you have to still practice seriously, but it's faster to achieve. And so his method involves setting up some very interesting situations. It's still based on seated meditation, but you meditate, and for instance, at certain times he has people focus on the solar plexus area. The reason is because the solar plexus area, if you can relax it, then the qi naturally descends in the body and it will go toward the lower abdomen and toward the perineum, right? And so he set up a number of different ways to facilitate the movement, or things like, quickly withdrawing the breath and lifting up the anus so that the qi moves more quickly along the spine. And so Li Xiaobo, he took many different types of practice from Taoism, from Daoyin, maybe even from the martial arts, and from medicine, and he integrated them all together to create his own version of the Xiaozhoutian, the small heavenly orbit, which is called Zhen Qi Yunxing Fa, right? The circulation method of the true qi. Now, why did he call that instead of like Xiaozhoutian Gongfu, right? Why didn't he call it that instead of small heavenly orbit skill? I think the reason is because Li Xiaobo, he was working toward helping people achieve things beyond the small heavenly orbit too, right? The small heavenly orbit is just part of practice. It's, we can say, it's like a basic. It's like a basic. Even internal alchemy practice treats it like a basic. It's just that internal alchemy practice takes a long time to mature, right? So it's a basic which can go to an intermediate level. But after that, there's other stuff to do still. And the same with Li Xiaobo's method. So his method, Zhen Qi Yunxing Fa, is the most famous one. And it's really a good method. And so then we should discuss what is it that makes the Qigong method different from the Neigong method? What makes it different from Daoyin? So if you look at Daoyin practice, generally, Daoyin practice will open things through stretching the body, through breath practices, and through visualization. So that's the specialization of Daoyin practice. Internal alchemy is really about transforming emptiness into movement or activity, non-being into being, right? That's the core fundamental epistemic idea of internal alchemy. And for Qigong practice, somewhere between the two, right? So for Qigong practice, you set the intention somewhere. And then you use softening of the intention, or sometimes, a little bit more intention in order to facilitate movement and to facilitate transformation. And then sometimes you can park the attention and let the energy rest, right? So you have, it's still post-heaven, but it's not as crude as the older Daoyin practices. It's more specialized. And the reason is because Qigong especially emphasizes Yi, or the mind, right? Yi, or intention, right? And so the special quality of Qigong can be summed up by the adage, where the mind arrives, the Qi arrives, right? Now, in internal alchemy practice, that's kind of a pejorative statement, actually. In the text Xingming Guizhi, which is the most complete internal alchemy classic, it uses the term when the mind arrives, the Qi arrives, to mean that when you're attracted to something in the external environment, when your attention arrives there, you lose Qi. But in Qigong, they turn the idea around and they make it a good idea. Where you place your mind is where your Qi will go in your body. And so if you know how to facilitate mental activity properly, you can generate Qi, you can lead Qi, and you can build Qi, right? That's the basic core idea of the Qigong approach to practice. So Li Xiaobo's version of the small heavenly orbit is especially focused on that idea, and he cleverly uses different parts of the body, which are not normally used in internal alchemy, in order to generate unique effects that cause the energy to be able to be generated, to move, to be led, and to be collected. And then ultimately, at the end of his practice, he proposes the idea that when the practice is mature, it turns into internal alchemy. And so what Li Xiaobo's method tries to do is to go from creating this new energy through the use of the mind, essentially, and the breath, and then have it gradually build up. And then finally, at the end, you go back to something which is the same as internal alchemy. You park the energy in the dantian, you enter into a state of profound tranquility, you achieve non-being, and the being becomes being, right? So in the end, it tries to become internal alchemy, whether it's successful or not. So that's the basic idea. Now, I'd like to touch on one more thing. What is the small heavenly orbit in the martial arts? So in the martial arts, there's two views of the small heavenly orbit for internal martial arts. The first one is that it's actually part of the process of Neigong, or internal skill practice. And so what that means is usually it would be some internal skills that you're working on outside of Chuanfa, right? Outside of actual direct martial practice, where you're doing things like stretching or, various different stuff. And at that time, then you can make the energy move through doing kind of meditation practices. And so the text, Yijinjing, right? The tendon changing classic, or the Xi Suijing, the marrow washing classic, right? The marrow washing classic actually is its own version of the small heavenly orbit. It's pretty similar to Neidan, but martial artists use that as their way of doing Neidan. On the other hand, there's also another text called the Neigong Sijing, the four classics of internal skill, which is part of the Song family of Xingyiquan, and it has its own version of the small heavenly orbit. And they're slightly different, but basically the Neigong Sijing version, it's a little bit more intention oriented, whereas the version in Xi Suijing, the marrow washing classic, it's a little bit more naturalistic and more similar to real Neidan. But there's another way the small heavenly orbit can open in Gongfu practice, in internal martial arts practice. And that is through correct posture and correct flexibility and correct movement of the body. So, for instance, in Xingyiquan, when you sink your buttocks toward the ground and allow your tailbone to hang down, and then you tuck in your chin, sometimes the spine is like an accordion, right? So it's sinking down in one direction and pulling up in another direction, and then it relaxes, right? This is one of the ways that Xingyi gets its power, opening and closing the chest, right? Opening and closing the lower back and abdomen. And over time, this natural stretching and the smoothness of the movement and the focus of the mind can actually cause the qi to go up the Ren meridian, and it can cause the muscles in the trapezius, right, so in the neck and the shoulders and the back, to relax downward. And that can facilitate the energetic opening of the spine and the qi going to the brain. And then the qi, it can be drawn back to the lower dantian just by sinking and focusing downward, right? And so the internal martial arts can spontaneously be used to open the small heavenly orbit, but that version of the orbit is, again, post-heaven, right? Because it's in the intention environment, whereas the pre-heaven is in the non-intention, self-forgetting environment. So it's a different small heavenly orbit from that of internal alchemy, but just like with Qigong and just like with Daoyin, there are points at which they cross over in practice and concept, and there's points where they don't, right? So broadly speaking, those are let's say, the most popular versions of the small heavenly orbit. And so I think I'm pretty confident to leave it here in terms of the generalities of the subject. Having said that, starting this October, it's my plan to release a short course on my Gumroad account about the small heavenly orbit from the perspective of Neidan, Daoyin, and Qigong. And so I'll let you know when it comes out. It'll be probably pretty similar timeline to the embryonic breathing course, right? So I'll make it over the course of a couple of weeks. Those who want to sign up early can be there, when I start putting stuff in. But when it's a complete package, I'll advertise it here on the YouTube channel. And if you're interested in it, then you're more than welcome to join. I love to be able to share this information with you. And also, if you like this video, before I wrap it up, make sure you give it a like and make sure you subscribe, because I saw that like 61% of the people that watch these videos are not subscribed. So if you like Qigong, you like the internal martial arts, you're interested in Taoist internal alchemy, hey, this is the place, I hope. So anyway, thank you very, very much again for choosing to come watch my video. I hope it was educational and beneficial to you. And I'll just keep putting them out as long as you like them. But if you want to let me know what you would like to learn about Qigong internal alchemy or the internal martial arts, let me know in the comments section. And I'll be happy to do my best to research it and make it happen. Okay, so we'll see you in the next video, and thanks again for watching.